Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. Kathleen Lucente and I have already been having a ball of a time. In fact, I wish we'd recorded it, Kathleen. It's often that the talks before and after are even more interesting than the podcast itself. And the podcast is pretty good too, I must say. The people are very interesting. But Kathleen is the CEO of Red Fan Communications. And we're talking about the same kind of world that she and I are in. We're both CEOs, trusted advisors, one on communication crises and strategies, and myself on leadership and, coaching and top teams. So, Kathleen, welcome. Great to have you here.
It's delighted to be here, Jonathan.
Well, look, so good to chat. And you're in Austin, Texas, as we're recording. And tell us a bit about your business and what it does. Give us a little thumbnail sketch of what Red Fan Communications do.
Sure. Now, I started Red Fan Communications 17 years ago here in Austin, Texas, after living in Hong Kong for 5.5 years and starting to realize it was time for me to start to really do this thing I had in the back of my mind, which was setting up in a boutique agency that is focused on B2B companies, in particular tech companies or companies who have tech stories that they want to tell, and establishing what I felt really wasn't available to me when I was managing agencies. While I saw some fantastic support, I felt that what we wanted to have was trusted advisors who'd been there, done that, brought companies public, had done M&A work, built out brand narratives. And those are the types of things that we do for our clients. So we are, we're working with clients. Some of our clients have been with us for 7 years. So they really come along and we scale with them and help them think about where they want to be and how we're going to get them there.
Yeah, that sounds great. And one of the things that struck me as we've got along, and I've really found it very easy. I mean, you're in communication, you'd expect it, but it's not. I'm afraid it's like someone in HR and you go, oh, they must be good with people. No, they're awful. they know the processes, but they can't get on with humans. But you've got a lovely ability to build rapport, and it's all around people. And we're also talking about family. And you have a fascinating great grandfather who I want you to talk a little bit about, and you've got some of his family history, and a grandmother who got to 102. So you got the combination of an Irish side and your husband's side from Italy, and Mussolini let them escape and get away to
Pittsburgh
to the Rust Belt. But yeah, tell me a bit about great grandfather and then grandmother at 102. I think that's quite fun.
Sure. So my great grandfather was George Murray Hulbert, and he actually at one point was the mayor of New York City. The mayor at the time had gotten ill and had to pass it to him. He was also part of the Roosevelt administration in a legal matter. He had been a judge. He'd moved kind of up through that. And then he also was, through that process, when you're in politics, you start low. So he was out doing all the things all the way, through to make, get to those levels. He also was the head of the Olympic Committee in the 1940s. Wow. And so I've had the privilege of going through all his paperwork, and, I'm seeing letters from women's bowling leagues that wanted to be part of the Olympic Committee written to him, or a letter from Roosevelt thanking him for a speech. And I love seeing all the documentation and the speeches, and he was so enamored with words. And so I understand and appreciate, that has been passed on to me in some capacity. And then my grandmother on the other side, Lillian Grace Hannon Bittman. So she came over from Ireland. Her mother actually first came over from Ireland, fell in love with a young man who actually in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They both had been in the same one-room schoolhouse in Ireland and had never spoken to each other. But on summer trip, while they both were working, for facilities up in camps and things like that in New Hampshire, they met each other and fell in love. And then my grandmother, of course, is there. So Lillian, fantastic woman, was the head of the telephone operators. She's also the first woman who, when she got married, my grandfather had a stroke early on, and back in the day, you had to give up your job if you got married, and she was the first woman to get reinstated with her job and all of her benefits. So she was a real, fire, cracker, if you will.
Oh, it's great, and I love the Irish connection because I've married into My wife's family is from Bundoran in Donegal. And when you get the family together, you have about 40 people in a room. Everybody's talking, no one's listening. It's fabulous. And they, one of the local pubs, there was this scenario that went on where you sort of walk in and you see a chap at the bar, and another chap comes in and he goes, "Hey, how are you?" And he goes, "Who are you?" And he goes, no, he said, no, he said, where are you from? He said, "Oh, I'm from a little village just outside Bandora, and it's called this." And he goes, "I'm from there too." "No," he said, "you weren't." He said, "Which school did you go to?" "I went to St. Margaret's." "No, I went to St. Margaret's too." "Yes, you did. My God, which year?" "Oh, I was there in 62. "Really? I was there in 62. And the guy turns to his other friend. "What's going on?" He said, "Oh, it's just the McGuinness twins. They always do this when they get together."
That's hilarious. That's hilarious. Yeah.
And they keep reminding each other where they come from and their connections.
I do love the connection with Ireland. I actually, when I was pregnant, living in Hong Kong, and I thought, gosh, I need to travel before I can't. I set up a trip to West Ireland, and hit all the good spots, and it was just fantastic. And going to the pub and just walking around, and we were up on the Burn, so we also did some fantastic historic walks, and I enjoy digging into my heritage.
Yeah, it's very special, family heritage, and I think just understanding people. You're in the world of communications. How do you get a message across to people? Words create worlds in the neurolinguistic programming kind of thing. The language you use is really important. People underestimate the impact of how they say something. They go, "I said nothing. I just said this." Yeah. But the language you use, be careful of it. And actually, funny enough, I think about it now with my two daughters, Harriet and Brownie. I've got a stepdaughter, Alana, and a stepson, Daniel, and they're all in their 30s now. But Brownie did linguistics at Cambridge, and Harriet did English at Bristol. So language is clearly very important to us too. Now, we were talking about fascinating people like your great grandfather and grandmother, inspiring leaders that you've met, and you said to me, "I actually have a number that I could talk about, and people that you would like to recommend to be guests on the Inspiring Leadership podcast." But you talked about Joe and you talked about Ralph. Do you want to say why you found Joe and who Joe is, and Ralph, who he is, why they were inspiring leaders to you?
Joe Evangelisti is the head of communications over at JPMorgan, and I joined that firm right when we were going through a merger, a Chase and JPMorgan merger. And what I would say is that he is an incredibly unassuming person, very charming, but also very caring about the reputation, and also very, very good at helping people move into the careers that they want to move into. So, I know he worked with Fred Hill, who was the CMO at the time when I was in New York, and I lived through 9/11. Joe and I were the only two people in his office when we saw the second plane hit. And so, he just handled himself very beautifully and was able to be very calm in a very stressful situation. He also was just great at taking one of the women on his team is now one of the top people as an investment banker. So she was in communications and now as an investment banker. So it just shows that kind of, he's a big thinker. He's also that calm in the storm, and he's still in his role today. He's been in that role a really long time. He always jokes that he started his career working in women's pantyhose. So he's quite unassuming, right? But he's brilliant. And then Ralph Parks, while I believe, he'd be retired now, but he actually, when I first got out to Hong Kong, I was only supposed to be there for 3 months. And I was supposed to be sort of assessing and helping the two. We had a co-head leadership team going on. One person was from Chase, one person was from JP Morgan, and they knew that one of them was going to get the role. In the end, essentially I wound up getting the role. That wasn't my plan, but Ralph Parks had worked at Goldman Sachs and all these places, and he was about 55 at the time and the chairman for 18 countries in Asia Pacific. And he said to me, "I've never been in the media. I've never, had to kind of be that spokesperson." Who's a fantastic leader, commanded such respect with his team. and really turned the company around out there. And I partnered with him. He said, "I'm putting myself in your hands." I said, "Well, you're going to have to be very transparent with me, and I need to understand, who you're hiring, who you're firing, how you're repositioning the company." We had stepped out of the equities business in that market, and it's hard to be an investment bank if you don't have the all the pieces. And he was really rebuilding that with the best in class. And so I had the opportunity to take us from number 5 to number 2 and then to number 1 in the region, but with
Wow.
partnership with him. So I think
Yeah.
he's a fantastic leader.
Yeah, and communications is so important in how you get this message across. And over the years, whether as an army officer being trained to be in front of a camera, tell a story, and things like the more junior the person you could get in front of the camera, if you're in Northern Ireland with a terrorist bombing or something like that, the more credible they are, and the more senior you are, the more, oh yeah, he would say that, wouldn't he?
Right.
So it's quite interesting. But I like the fact that you've built Redfan Communications around the idea that traditional agencies fail leaders. And I wondered, what's the most controversial move you've made to disrupt the status quo? And did it ever backfire?
Well, I would say that, one, it's even if you were going into trying to become a manager, you're always observing who are the good managers you've had, who are the not so great managers you've had, and you start to think about that. And so when I was building Redfan, one of the things that I set up was we have a very strong screening system for the clients we'll take on or not take on, and we actually do a voting on our side. So I'll sit down with the team afterwards and say, did that potential client, do they fit with where we want to go? Can we do our best work for them? And if they're looking to bark orders or just say, can you get press releases out, or they're just not listening, we basically fire them without them knowing it within the first call. We're saying, this is not, so we're about conversations. We don't send over proposals. We don't just shoot out proposals. And a lot of people will call agencies and say, can you just, send us a proposal? What's the price? And that is already a red flag. We slow them down and say, hey, we need to have conversations, and we want to meet your leadership team. We want to know who we're representing, right? And we want to see if there's a real good connection for them and for us to make sure it's a win-win. The other big one we do is we put the people in front of the client that are going to work on the work. That is not true with a lot of agencies. They'll put out the senior people and do this whole song and dance and then pass it. So, has it backfired? I would say there's probably some business that, I could have shot off a proposal to and fallen on my sword on that policy. I still think the problem is that if you win the business, you don't know who you're working with. And I feel like this is a very intense business. You need to really feel like you connect, and you feel like the ethics are the same, and people are wanting to, jump in.
Yeah, and I think that's nicely, because I was just thinking about on the CEO's Compass, the book that's coming out, how to navigate your team through turbulent times, that you and I, the moral quotient, the MQ, the true north, is a really important one, which in some agencies, you're not sure where their line is. And you work with a lot of the Fortune 500 companies. And there may be occasions where you think, oh, it's probably best we don't reveal that bit of information to the public or to stakeholders. But what has been your ethical guidelines to people when they dither over that kind of thing? Should we reveal it? Should we not? How do you guide people on that?
Well, first, if there's an issue bubbling up, I make sure we have the right people in the room. And because the biggest challenge is an executive that's getting pulled in multiple directions. And so, if legal is saying one thing and the, communications is saying another thing, you need to get to resolve. What I like to do is say, let's play the tape forward. If you don't reveal this bit of information, it will come out eventually. I was working with a major financial institution that had a very small, I would say, exposure to a very, very large and public lawsuit. And the legal team was suggesting, no, let's not reveal it. Let's not reveal it. And my guidance was it will come out later and it will be a much bigger sore to deal with. And I have seen that actually happen where, in some cases, companies are having to pick, am I going to listen to my CMO, my communications leader, or my legal team? And ideally, if we can come together, we can actually think that through together and figure out, well, if we mention it now, yes, there'll be some fallout, but I'd much rather have this fallout now. And I think we have a very ethical way to answer it, and we have nothing to hide. Whereas if you hide it, it will seem like you are being unethical, and it will seem like you had reason to hide it, and it now turns into a much larger media relations issue. It erodes trust in your brand.
And that's such a big thing, Kathleen. And I can see how there's a natural setup for conflict between the chief legal officer and the head of communications and marketing. And this, well, actually, legally, we've not done anything wrong by the letter of the law. Yeah, I know, but how would it land if it went on the front page of a newspaper? Would you be happy reading about that? Correct. And I think time and again, people will hide behind the technical legal aspect. It's not actually wrong, but this is where CEOs have to deal with shades of gray. It's not black or white. And by the time it gets given to the CEO who you're trying to advise, the reason they've passed it up to them, they've upward delegated it because no one else knows what to do about it. Yeah, and that's why they're paid to do the really difficult stuff.
We insist that, to be perfectly honest, we really only want to do crisis comm for companies that are already working with us, correct? And there are many agencies out there that will take crisis work because it's a big ticket item. You have an oil spill, you're like, great, let's just take the money and we'll handle it. But if the C-suite's not being ethical, I'll lose other clients. They'll look at me. We're smaller, and they know what our how we walk. And it would be out of character for us to support a company that does not match our values, and or we don't know them well enough to know, are they being honest? And so when you have a client that you're already working with and they are willing to invest in a crisis, strategy plan, they, at least you're not building the plane and while you're trying to fly it, right? You actually have some understanding of what the moving parts are, and you're able to, support them a lot more effectively.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I love a term that you use, that you say you leave no stone unturned. And I wonder, without naming anybody, but have you ever uncovered something about a client or a situation which made you question whether you want to keep working with them?
I would say first of all, I think it's important to know that I have a journalism background. So that's part of my kind of investigative reporting. And the other side, I think it's important to know, is that I'm probably the only person in my family that did not go to law school, but I grew up surrounded by lawyers and judges. So all of that swirling around me makes me very, it's almost like it's part of who I am. And so I like to do my homework up front. I will say, yes, we have had a client where the communications manager was fantastic, but even he started to help us understand that this client was, being told like maybe, there's sexual harassment behaviors or things that were happening. And I think possibly maybe they were having some drinking issues or things of that nature, but we were not present for those behaviors. But there was starting to become some gray area that we couldn't know how he was going to behave. And so luckily our engagement was ending anyway. So we did not renew when we started to realize these behaviors were coming up. And we were lucky enough, because we had such a trusted relationship with the communications manager. He let us know these things were happening, and he too was leaving. So we both exited essentially at the same time. Although I do have a friend who brought somebody on TV, major in New York City, and the gentleman had not been honest about the fact that he had tax evasion issues, and he was a CEO. And those reporters investigated that and started bringing that up on TV, and she was absolutely mortified because he had not been transparent. And so, she was then now dealing with that aftermath. So we like to do our due diligence and really understand what's going on with people. But there's going to be things that happen you can't, like the example that I have, that if somebody starts kind of going off the edge, you kind of have to evaluate and figure out, like, how strong is your relationship? Can you say something to them about maybe getting help? Or what I did discover is this person was getting help from other people, but maybe was not taking that help, and so that was another red flag.
Yeah, it is interesting over my 63 years that I've often wanted to look for the sort of perfect man or woman as a leader, that they are without fault. I haven't yet found them. And the more I coach people and get to know them, the more I realize that, like me, they're full of fault and imperfections, and they've made mistakes. But I think the 10 words, 3 phrases that my friend Jeff Nischwitz from Florida shared with me is, I was wrong. I don't know. I need some help.
100%.
Now, when your CEOs that you and I are advising can use those words, and they allow their own team to use those words, we're in a healthy place where vulnerability is okay. And they can go on TV or whatever it is and say, we're withdrawing all these products from the market. A few cases have been contaminated, but we're just taking the whole lot off because it's the right thing to do. I'm reminded of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who talked about, why do we always look for the third thing? The first thing is do the right thing. The second thing is, because it's the right thing, why are you looking for the third thing where they're going to praise you for doing the right thing? Just do it because it's the right thing. I don't know. Does any of that resonate for you?
Yeah. I mean, ethics, my radar for ethics, my radar for just seeing, the questions that I ask a potential client before they're joining us. The fact that I'm not only talking to the communications manager or CMO, but I want to meet the CEO. I want to make sure I understand who we're representing, and I want to see if they're engaged and understand, would they do the right thing? How are they evaluating their internal communications to their employees? Do they see that as a value? I was just talking to a company recently. It's over $1 billion company, and the CMO let me know that they have no internal communications whatsoever. And I thought, that is like a huge red flag. And she is trying to bring that up multiple times to the CEO, and they just don't seem to see, it's kind of, they had an attitude of, if you're here, you get it. And that is just the bad example. Your employees are, even if you're thinking about the next generation that's coming in, and you're trying to understand, how do people want to receive information? Do they understand what their role is in the company, and what the mission is, and how they can be impacting that? Are you creating a culture of transparency, right? So I'm a big believer in a culture of transparency here at Redfan. We're very open about, what our finances are, what the goals are, how we're being impacted. That is presented every quarter to my team. That is not true in most agencies, and we're small. So imagine a large company with, hundreds of employees that are not being communicated to, or it's up to the manager and they're not getting communicated to. So, that's chaos.
You make me smile, because I was coaching someone in America just a couple of hours ago, a very senior role, and he's in sales, a very senior role in sales. And he was being given a really hard time by the CEO of the parent company. And they were going, well, your numbers are all over the place. He goes, well, it would really help me if you let me see what those numbers are. I'm blind to what it is. You're not letting me see all the numbers, but yet he was being held accountable for them. Now, that's really unfair.
Yeah.
And the more that you share your stories, Kathleen, the more I'm thinking, particularly with all the research I've done over the last year and the 400 guests I've had, that the values and the things that I've written about in the CEO's Compass, they're very similar to what you're talking about. It's a real meeting of minds between us. And it's nice to find that, particularly around the point about the CEO does matter. Who is the man or woman leading this organization? Because the fish rots from the head, or the tone is set by the top. And if you have a leader who is a narcissist, and a subclinical psychopath, and a bully, and Machiavellian, it's not going to end well. It's really, I mean, they might get results for a year or two, but there'll be a culture of fear. There'll be psychological lack of safety. People like we saw in Lehman Brothers. I was in PricewaterhouseCoopers, and one of my friends was a senior PwC accountant who worked with him for many years. And he said, even now, after we're dealing with sweeping up the results of things, they still have a culture of good news, and failure is not an option. So when things are going well, great. But when things are going badly, everybody has to give good news, and they can't fail. So they make stuff up, or they adjust the graph. And I had one woman who had alopecia. She was losing her hair because she was working for a boss who made her change the graphs and the statistics so it still looked better than it was. Yeah. And I don't know whether you've come across that or uncovered that, but that goes on.
I would say I have been so lucky. I have not had to work for somebody like that. I know it exists, and I know there are people like that. I have set my North Star on it, even as a young, teaching at Boston College, freshman English, or getting my first job in editorial. I was always very careful to be looking at who am I working for. And I think that this is a little bit kind of like how I was raised. I am very outgoing, but I'm also very cautious and aware. And I've always had this incredible spidey sense, and I've always trusted that in myself. And I take for granted that I thought everybody had that, but honestly, it has really, that combined with facts, but like truly, it has been an excellent tool.
Let's talk about spidey sense. I think it's very interesting, and then we'll go on to. I want to hear your legacy story. Your origin story, how it shaped the leader you are today. But I think this is a really important point you raised. The spidey sense that the Germans call it Fingerspitzgefühl, this fingertip feel, and intuition, gut feeling. Now, my neurobiologist friend of mine says that we've got 89 billion neurons in our brain, which is sort of the logic and the rational. We've got 40,000 around our heart. So our heart is like a mini brain, and 100 million in our gastrointestinal tract, which has the vagus nerve, which runs all the way from the gut to the brain. And there's more communications going from the mini brains to the brain than there are the other way. So if you really are at the top of your game, and now at the age of 63, without being cocky, because I still make lots of mistakes, I've got a lot more of the spidey feel than I had when I first began out, and I just blundered through things. I'm now going, something doesn't feel right. Now, often it's the result of experience. I got ripped off to the tune of £300,000 by a bunch of fraudsters who were selling property in Cyprus, and the next person who got involved smelled the blood in the water, said they were fraudsters, and then the lawyer involved was a fraudster, and the bankers were, and it got worse and worse, and you got the Russians involved and all sorts. Anyway, long story was, my gut was shouting out, this is wrong. But my head was going, no, you need to sell these apartments. It'll be okay. This guy is honest. But my gut was going, no, don't trust him. And so I do think much more we should really be in tune with that spidey sense. If something doesn't feel right, it doesn't get better with time. You've got to deal with it. It's not going to get better. Just hoping it'll go away.
It's very true. I was one of the things that happens when I'm putting together a crisis plan is I interview the C-suite, right? And I get to understand what are the things that keep you up at night? How would you handle this situation? And I'm kind of pulling together what are all the things that could possibly go wrong, and I'm putting them in a sheet, and we actually do reenactments. But my spidey sense around one of the C-suite members during one of these exercises was telling me there were some trust issues, also capabilities issues. And I went and talked to the CEO and let him know, I really think this person is in the wrong role. And also they don't have your best interest at heart. And I think you need to watch out. I think that this person has their own agenda. And sure enough, I was in, and he's like, well, I'm watching, but I've really confided in this person. I was like, so this is a risk that I'm taking, right? That I'm bringing this forward, but I really felt strongly. So I had some factual information, and my spidey sense was kind of really on fire. Sure enough, I'm at a client's wedding in Mexico, in Oaxaca, and I get a call. My cell phone's ringing. I'm dressed up. I'm getting ready to go, and it's the CEO calling to say that this person, while he's on vacation, has quit and promises not to tell anyone for, until he gets back from holiday. I said, that is not going to happen. That's not going to happen. She's going to cause a swirl of drama, and here's what we need to do. And so I was able to help him but he still really believed in her. He believed that she would hold her promise, and there was nothing she was going to do to hold that promise. In fact, she was already creating chaos, in the office, and creating a lot of problems. And so I knew exactly, who we had to pull together. Imagine the two of us are both on vacation, right? I'm about to head into a wedding. He's, on a beach somewhere. But we were able to get it figured out. But ever since then, the spidey sense has been very, very clear that had to happen. And another fun example would be when I was in Hong Kong, we made sure every head of investment bank had to be media trained. And our head of investment bank in Korea was kind of withholding, putting it off. And one day I was like, it's been really quiet in Korea. I just feel like something's happening. He calls me. I held a press conference. Really? Can you help me? We said the wrong things at it. Okay. We said the wrong things to Bloomberg. I said, we can't withdraw information from Bloomberg. My client was there and he said X. I said, well, was it factual or was it misunderstood? And sure enough, I pulled the head of Bloomberg on the phone. I got the two people and I was able to resolve that for them. And never again did they pull that kind of silly business. But I just had a feeling like it's been too quiet. Like they're doing some of their own stuff. I've got to figure this out. And the sad news is that he created a problem for himself. The good news is I could clean it up, and then trust was built immediately, and media training did happen, and we moved forward.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. That it's trusting your instinct, and also when it's all gone a bit quiet, just watch out. It's like with small children, or in my days with soldiery, as my sergeant major would say to me. So when the soldiers are not ticking and complaining, something's up. What's going on? It's all gone very quiet. What's happening?
That's correct. Yeah. So you want to make sure you want to get things, get a pulse, figure out what's happening.
Yeah, exactly. And it is that reading the pulse. So all this spidey sense, lawyers around the family, the Irish connection, the Italian connection. What is it about your origin story, your upbringing, that's made you the successful leader you are today, advising CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies? Tell me, what shaped you?
I would say, I'm the oldest in my family, a family of two girls. My father, one of the things I really started to watch I was lucky to have a very active dad who was very active in our lives, but he made very interesting choices. So, for example, he was a part of a very prestigious law firm in New York City where you make tons of money, but you're also never around. And so when I was just going into second grade, he decided family was more important, and he was going to reverse commute from where we lived on Long Island out another hour, the opposite direction of New York City, and join the oldest law firm and kind of, make sure that was a good fit. And if it was, then he was going to move us further out. And then, he could be very readily available. And that's exactly what he did. And my father was also very big into literature. We would read Shakespeare together. We would go on adventures. And he was a huge mentor to me. And he was one of these people that, later in life, I wrote his eulogy. His name was Lawrence, Larry for short. I would channel him. If I'm thinking about making a decision, he is literally in my head. made such a huge influence on me. And I think that also having two grandmothers who were really kind of, matriarchs, that his mother, spoke Spanish, French, English. She, she had traveled extensively, obviously with her father, who, is a politician. And so being around all of that, almost you learn how to be a statesman. You learn how to what is correct, ethics, how to carry yourself, and all of those people in my life having good family matters. It's so foundational for me.
Yeah, you are the company of the five people you spend your most time with. That they will influence you, and I know over the years at times I've reminded myself, this person is not adding love, life, and happiness to you. Why are you spending time with him or with her? And this is unhealthy. And I think too often people stay in a friendship or a relationship which is very toxic and unhealthy, and it's bringing them down as well. So choose wisely. I think it
believe
was
that. Yeah,
Epictetus said you can't choose who your parents were, but you can choose who you want to be the children of.
I agree. I agree. And one of the things I tell, and I've written about this, that being a CEO is a lonely place for most, because if hopefully you're transparent and you're able to be somewhat vulnerable with your team, which creates trust, but building sort of a group of advisors that you can go to, kind of like your own personal board, is so important in life, I think. And so I encourage people to do that. It doesn't have to be one person. It could be a variety of people that you, have lunch with or coffee with on a quarterly basis, and you're adding to their lives too. And so I think that's a very important discipline to have.
Yeah, and I, as I coach people, I think there's a lovely overlap between what we do and a synergy. But as I coach the CEOs I work with, I think have a virtual wisdom council of people who are advising you. It could be Larry, it could be Shakespeare, it could be Winston Churchill, or some of the people from your childhood. And if they were watching you now, would they be proud of you? If they were all around you, would you really do that, knowing that they're there with you? And it's a good reminder to me as well when there comes moments that might no one be around, but actually I know, and I think this is really important. Talking about experiences in life, we learn a lot from our successes, but I learn much more from my failures and some darker times. What was the darkest moment in your life, Kathleen, and what did it teach you?
I have a couple. And I would say on my personal life, I would say my father in particular, because as we've talked about, he was such a huge influence in my life. I think it was a Thursday. I got a call from my sister, who's a cardiac nurse up in New York. And she said, and I had said, I was just talking to Dad, and he doesn't sound right. And so she's like, let's get him to the hospital. Let's check him out. And he was like in his early 70s. They did some blood tests. I got a call, back saying, hey, there's some cancer markers. And I went on up. I flew up thinking, cancer is something you hear about all the time. I figured this is terrible, but I probably have at least some time with him. When I got to the hospital, I quickly learned he would be gone in less than 48 hours.
Wow.
And I sat with him and I felt guilt. I had lived in Hong Kong. I live in Austin, Texas. I've always done my own thing. And he said, are you kidding? I never would have gotten to visit, Australia or Hong Kong or any of the things. I'm so proud of you. So it was very strange to be almost like saying goodbye. And then, I had to set up for him to go to hospice and go over to hospice and imagine, it was like him getting hit by a bus, because his law partner came over and I had to help him, transfer information. My father was literally shutting down. When someone's in hospice, you're watching them shut down. And I would be like, okay, close your eyes for a little bit. And now you're going to open them and we're going to have this conversation with, your partner. And, it was a short conversation, but I had already gotten everything down. So, and then writing his eulogy, which I interviewed a lot of my family members about, how they were feeling, and I knew how I was feeling. And so while family members went off to do sort of a thing at my sister's home, I sat and wrote the eulogy, and it was just really, really hard. It was really, really hard for me. Ironically, I had this huge Halloween party here at the office that was taking place, and it was my father said to me, "You better not miss your Halloween party."
Mm.
And I came back and I dressed up like the Queen of Hearts, and we had that party. And one of the things that was also interesting for me was, as I was flying back, I kept thinking, gosh, I chose to live in Austin, Texas. I've been there 10 years at the time. I've now been here 20. Will anyone really understand the pain I'm going through? And what I found, the amount of hearts and cards and things, I realized I had built such an incredible community here. I underestimated the amount of love that was here for me. So,
and I'm not surprised you've built a special community. There's a authenticity and a emotional intelligence about you, which it's a standout quality you have. And as you speak about the 48 hours that you learned you had, it really resonated with me, because 4 years ago, David, my middle brother, was given a very short space of time after he had been found to have metastatic cancer, which had gone everywhere. And they had to take a vertebrae out to keep him from being paralyzed. They had to pin his leg. They had to radiate his brain. And really, it was 10 weeks from diagnosis to death. And spending time with David, sitting, I can still visualize it now, sitting outside his house. He was on a wooden bench, and I was just sitting in the sun, just chatting to him. And I thought, this is probably the last time I will be with my brother. It's very poignant, because we know, if we live to 80, which many of us may not do, we have 4,000 weeks.
Oh, interesting.
It's not very long. And if I'm going to live to 72, I have 9 more Christmases. It brings it all into perspective. My father was 33 when he was killed flying. We've discussed this before. He didn't plan when he went out on that flight. He didn't know that was the last flight in his Buccaneer aircraft. He just thought that was another day. And
Absolutely.
So it has made me, hearing your father's story, his last 48 hours, value today. I have today. I woke up this morning. I'm alive. How lucky am I? And I think this gratitude and appreciation, they aren't soft and squidgy things. They're value this day. You do not know whether you'll be awake tomorrow, or what happens, or you step across the road and slam, a motorbike hits you, or whatever. And I've seen too much death and too much sadness to not appreciate what goes on. What do you find?
I was reflecting on this, and I was thinking about some things, some signals that came to me. I remember I was at a big PR firm in New York City, and we were asked to put a quote out on, with our photo outside our office. And I did sort of a Fred Astaire, she can do it, do it better in high heels and all that good stuff, and walking backwards. But I noticed that a lot of the male executives were putting up their airline mileage, like how much they travel. And the bragging was not something I find attractive, right? Like something I don't aspire to. And I thought, gosh, these are the people I should be looking up to. And this is what they are putting out, my, airline mileage. And I thought, I thought of my dad when he made that choice, right? And I still, I don't regret any of the cool decisions I've made about living, in different parts of the world. But I also, as soon as I had kids, I really started thinking what is it I want for them? And how do I want that experience to be? And I also feel like you can live anywhere. You don't have to be master of the universe and live in a city that's going to grind you up. You can still do incredible work and have, a great success, and live somewhere that's maybe a little bit more relaxing and also gives you the ability to have what you want for your family. And I grew up with that. So I've recreated that for my family.
Yeah, I think it's so important. And you said you had a second dark moment. What was the second moment?
Well, the second dark moment, I would say I lived through 9/11, and I also lived through, so 9/11 was hard, really hard. I I woke up that morning. I was working in investment banking. I was supposed to go down to Wall Street that morning, and the executive I was going to see called me right as I was hitting the train, and he was like, "Hey, I finished my meeting. You don't have to go down to Wall Street. You get to go to Midtown. I'll meet you there." So I went to headquarters, and nobody was on the floor other than Joe Evangelisti, my colleague at the time. And I went in to see his office, and his partner called him and said, "I just saw a plane hit." And we had the TVs on. They weren't on. I mean, they weren't. There's nothing on the news about this, and we thought, oh, it's just probably a toy plane. We were dismissing him and what he was saying, and within a few minutes, that was coming up on the news, and so we're still sort of sitting there. And then the second.
So where was your office in comparison to the towers? Where was it?
It was just past the MetLife building, so we actually could see the second plane come in and hit. You can see it hit. You could see the explosion, and so that was like an E.F. Hutton moment. A few more people had arrived at the office at that point. We were all standing around, and it was just silence. And what was interesting was most people.
It's almost like you were not watching it on television. You were watching it out of your window.
Yeah.
Whoa.
And then it came up on TV, so it was kind of like a double. And my husband was working in Times Square. Our cell phones were not working. It was just chaos. And reporters actually started calling us within about an hour and a half, which was interesting, asking if we had lost anybody, like what did we know, those types of things. And did we actually have safe deposit boxes that were getting pilfered? There's all this terrible type of the kind of news you should not be even thinking about. Low level, not great quality journalism. And it was just sad to see that people were focusing on that type of thing when lives were lost. I walked home after my husband actually broke past security because he was trying to get to me, and ran up, and he was standing in front of me in a suit, sweat all the way through. And we had only been married a year. He's like, "Oh God, thank God you're okay." Because he didn't even know which way I'd gone. Had I gone to Wall Street? Had I gone here? So it was hard to communicate.
So if you had gone to Wall Street,
yeah,
what would have happened?
I would have been safe, hopefully, if I had been up in our building, which was 60 Wall Street. But luckily, we didn't lose anybody at the time. So I would have been, I guess I would have been safe, but I would have been in the crux. If I had been walking out to get a cup of coffee, or I had been anywhere near, my cousin worked at Aon at the time, and he was jokingly hungover and didn't get to work on time that day, or he would have actually been in the building. So, there's a lot of, and my father's best friend's daughter was the head of all the waitresses at Windows on the World at the top, and had just married a man from Ireland, and she perished. And so it kind of had this every day you discovered there was a new connection. But I walked home from JPMorgan that day. I remember looking at the Empire State Building and thinking, "Oh gosh, that's next," And we, at the moment when this was happening, it felt like maybe people are coming out of the sky. What's coming next? We really didn't have a feeling, and so when you're in it, it was scary. It was very scary. I did not leave. Most of my colleagues were panicked. They were getting in trucks to leave because they thought the bridge and the tunnels were going to get shut down. Fast forward, I did live in Hong Kong a couple of years later, pretty soon. I also went through SARS, right? So I'm very, and then back here, we've had our own issues, right, too. So I feel like I've lived through, I actually wrote the airborne disease crisis comm for the investment bank, and we shared it with other competing investment banks. So yeah, those are dark days. Those are dark days.
And I'm just still sort of computing what happened for you. And what would you say, looking back now, what kind of philosophy has it given you for life and for appreciating what you do have?
Well, one of the things I would say is I stayed. I learned some things about myself. I didn't go into panic mode. I kind of stayed and was like, I need to assess what's happening, and I need to be able to support what's going on. Me running around like a chicken with my head cut off is not going to do anything. So I was very able to be there with my colleagues who stayed. Later on, we were able to do like serious assessment of like, who is anyone been hurt? What's going on? And then the psychological impact of this is much bigger in some ways for people. Like, how long will that last? People are afraid to come into the city. So really sitting down and understanding, like, how do you support employees through a crisis? How do you help them? And we went up, having psychological support. We put a lot of different things in place that you wouldn't necessarily think about, maybe 25 years earlier, right? Like, I feel like we're much more sophisticated in how we think about the impact that things can happen, the PTSD that happens for people.
So before we go into the top tip, because we're near the end of our time and there's so much we could talk about, if you would give a bit of advice from your experience over the years of the smartest thing you've seen a CEO do in a crisis and a biggest mistake you've seen a CEO do in a crisis, what would you, smartest thing, the craziest thing? And there may be the opposite, but if you could choose two different themes.
The thing that I try to look at is the CEO going to be an eagle or an ostrich in a crisis? I've seen when something difficult is happening, and you can see the star, the person who's the real leader, is the one who can be the eagle and is ready to be available and communicate during difficult times to stakeholders about what's happening. And even if they don't have the full answer, be able to communicate, this is what we know at this stage and this is what we're investigating, versus, hey, I'm going to hide under my desk and let everyone else clean up the problem. That's such a huge indicator of leadership, and not everyone's cut out for it, to be honest with you. There are leaders who, really don't know how to be that. And I think it's important to be able to do your own inventory of yourself and understand where you need to grow as a leader, or if you even have that capacity. Like I said, it's not a role for everybody. And so I appreciate watching executives that are able to evolve. And, what I say is, like, how do we communicate difficult truths, with honesty and dignity, and also protect your company at the same time, right? So, and how do we, factor in the stakeholders that need to be spoken to? And this is true even if it's not a crisis. It's like we do a ton of merger and acquisition work. And it's so often people are trying to get that deal done, and they don't think about, how are we speaking to the stakeholders? They don't want to find out about it through a press release. They want to hear directly. They want to be treated, like a special class, first class, a person associated with your business. And so, understanding, like once again, play the tape forward. Think through, what are going to be the outcomes if you don't communicate, and how do you want to be viewed? And even if you have to lay people off, like, how are you handling that? That's probably one of the hardest things I've seen companies handle, and some people have done it extremely well, and others, kind of outsource it. And I think it's really important for a CEO and a C-suite to lead that and talk about compassion and put the right systems in place so that the people who are left behind, who stay at a company where a layoff is not handled properly, they feel that impact as well.
Yeah. And I've personally experienced that, where good CEOs are prepared to have the difficult, courageous conversations and to own it, the decision that they have chosen to do, and the weaker ones hide in their office. I remember the 2008 crisis, where the good ones were out on the floor going, guys, it's moving every hour. There's a different bit of information to share with you, and I'll tell you what I know as it going along. And the poor ones were waiting for everything to settle down before they communicated anything, because they couldn't kind of work out what to do. And as a result, they were paralyzed in their own offices, and everybody was going, what's going on? And in a vacuum, they began to panic. Before we go on to your top tip, if we went back to see the young Kathleen Lucente, age 16 to 18, and you went back to the future in your DeLorean car, stepped out and met yourself, what would you say this matters and this doesn't matter? What bit of advice would you give to the younger self?
I would probably let Kathleen know that she is going to go a lot farther than she anticipated, and that she needs to just, recognize that every relationship she makes along the way is going to be building towards that, but not to slow down. Don't slow down. Keep moving. There's a whole world, and you're going to not have a straight line. It's going to be all these different mentors are going to lead to something very interesting, and keep that feistiness because it's going to pay off.
Thank you. And it's really important with the inspiring female leader CEOs. The men will blag it if they know 50% of what's required. The women that a female headhunter of mine said, I'm so frustrated with my female colleagues that when I try and hire them for this great role as a CEO or a senior executive, they go, I've only got 95% of the skills. The blokes will blag it at 50. So what would be your advice to female CEOs that are listening to this around the world to encourage them to step forward into that space and own it and have the courage to take on the men?
I strongly believe female CEOs should have an incredible communications manager working with them that helps them build out, what are going to be the areas that they want to own? What are going to be the, speaking areas and topics? And they should build out a group of people that they can trust that are raising them up every day. That kind of unofficial board of people is so important. Understanding. So, if you think you're weak in an area, like, have somebody who's fantastic in that area be a mentor to you, but don't slow down because, like you said, most people are faking it till they make it. And, there's tons of people out there that have imposter syndrome. But if you are actually putting the work in, you're going to do great. The fact that you can recognize where you think you can improve means you're just somebody who wants to keep educating themselves for the rest of their lives, and you're going to grow. And that's what leadership should be.
Fantastic. So, Kathleen, would you say who you are, what you're doing now, what you've done in the past, and what your top tip is? And this stands in its own right. Over to you.
Okay. I'm Kathleen Lucente. I'm the CEO and founder of Red Fan Communications in Austin, Texas. We are a B2B communications firm focused on companies with tech stories or tech focused. And my tip would be the eagle, not the ostrich. Absolutely. Like be the CEO that wants to, or leader that wants to care about the stakeholders and truly, think about the people that are around you and how you are communicating with them, because that is going to be a huge force of energy. Don't forget that when you build authority, you get access. When you build credibility, you get open conversations. And when you build a reputation, you get retention. And so that's a financial bridge that's going to hold over in a really great way for you.
Kathleen, I've loved this conversation. It's been a very real conversation, very raw at times. And you are clearly a master of what you do. And I think CEOs are very lucky to have you as their advisor. And good luck with the work you do.
Thank you so much. And thanks for having me on today.
My pleasure.